There's something remarkable about a man who became the world's richest person by age 39, held that title for years, then systematically gave most of it away while somehow becoming even more influential. This is the story of Bill Gates, a journey from obsessive teenage programmer to software monopolist to global health revolutionary, a life that embodies both the promise and perils of American technology entrepreneurship. Our story begins on October 28, 1955. In Seattle, Washington. William Henry Gates III was born into privilege, though not extraordinary wealth. His father, Bill Gates Sr., was a successful attorney. His mother, Mary Maxwell Gates, came from a prominent banking family and served on numerous corporate and charitable boards. This was upper-middle-class Seattle society, comfortable and well-connected. Young Bill was the second of 3 children, with an older sister Christiane and younger sister Libby. From early childhood, he was intensely competitive. Family game nights were serious affairs where Bill hated to lose at anything: board games, card games, puzzles. His parents encouraged intellectual competition, rewarding achievement and clever thinking. But Bill was also difficult. He argued with his mother constantly, questioning rules and authority. He was messy, disorganized about everything except his intellectual interests, and seemed to live inside his own head. His parents worried about him, this brilliant but socially awkward child who rocked back and forth when thinking and seemed disconnected from normal social cues. At age 11, his parents sent him to a therapist, concerned about his behavior and the constant conflicts with his mother. The therapist eventually told Mary Gates something that would shape how she approached her son: "You're going to lose this battle. You need to let him be who he is." It was advice that recognized Bill's fundamental nature: intensely driven, intellectually focused, and resistant to external control. In 1967, Bill enrolled at Lakeside School, an exclusive private school in Seattle. This decision would change everything, not just for Bill but for the history of computing. Lakeside had something almost no schools had in 1968: access to a computer. The Lakeside Mothers Club had raised money to buy a teletype terminal connected by phone line to a mainframe computer. Students could write programs in BASIC, submit them via the terminal, and receive results. Computer time was expensive, charged by the minute, but Lakeside provided students access to this remarkable resource. Bill was transfixed. He spent every available moment at that teletype, learning to program, testing ideas, finding bugs, and pushing the limits of what the system could do. He wasn't alone. A group of students became similarly obsessed, including Paul Allen, 2 years older than Bill, who would become his crucial partner. Bill and Paul were kindred spirits. Both were brilliant, both were obsessed with computers, and both saw possibilities that others missed. They formed a friendship built on shared passion, competitive drive, and complementary skills. Paul was the better pure programmer initially, but Bill was relentless, focused, and already thinking about business applications. The Lakeside Computer Club quickly exhausted their free computer time. The boys needed more access but had no money to pay for it. So they did what entrepreneurial teenagers would do: they found ways to get computer time in exchange for work. A local company, Computer Center Corporation, let the Lakeside students use their computers in exchange for finding bugs in the system. Bill, Paul, and their friends spent countless hours testing the limits of the computers, deliberately crashing systems to identify weaknesses. It was hacking in its original sense, exploring systems to understand how they worked. When Computer Center Corporation eventually banned them for exploiting the system too aggressively, the boys found other arrangements. They worked for a company automating payroll systems. They got access to university computers. Wherever there were computers, Bill found ways to use them. By the time he was in high school, Bill was already a professional programmer. He and Paul started a small company called Trafo Data, which analyzed traffic flow data. It wasn't particularly successful commercially, but it taught them about running a business, dealing with customers, and translating technical skills into commercial products. Bill was also excelling academically. He scored 1590 out of 1600 on his SATs and was a National Merit Scholar. He could have gone to any university. He chose Harvard, enrolling in 1973 at age 17. At Harvard, Bill was brilliant but unfocused. He took advanced mathematics and computer science courses, often skipping classes but acing exams. He played poker obsessively, sometimes for days at a time. He was known for eating pizza at odd hours, falling asleep in classes he bothered attending, and being generally disheveled and intense. But Bill wasn't really engaged with Harvard in the way the institution expected. He was waiting for something, though he might not have known exactly what. That something arrived in December 1974, when Paul Allen showed him a magazine cover. The January 1975 issue of Popular Electronics featured the Altair 8800, a build-it-yourself microcomputer kit. It was primitive by any standard: no screen, no keyboard, just switches and lights. But Bill and Paul immediately recognized what it represented. Computers were becoming small and affordable enough for individuals to own. This was the moment they'd been preparing for through all those hours at the Lakeside Teletype, all the bug finding and system crashing, all the trafo data lessons. Personal computers were coming, and they needed software. Bill and Paul contacted MITS, the company making the Altair, and claimed they had developed a basic programming language for the machine. This was a lie. They had nothing. But they had confidence they could create it quickly. Working manically for 8 weeks, Paul doing much of the initial coding while Bill optimized and refined, they created Altair Basic. Paul flew to MITS headquarters in Albuquerque to demonstrate it. The software worked, barely, running on an Altair for the first time in that demonstration. MITS agreed to distribute it. Bill was 19 years old. He had just created the first commercial software product for a personal computer. And he made a decision that would define his career. He dropped out of Harvard. His parents were not pleased. They had raised him with expectations of professional achievement: lawyer, doctor, professor. Dropping out to pursue this uncertain computer venture seemed reckless. But Bill was convinced. Personal computers were the future, and software would be crucial. If he waited, the opportunity would pass. Bill and Paul founded Microsoft, originally Microsoft, a combination of microcomputer and software, in April 1975. They moved to Albuquerque to be near MITS and began developing software in earnest. From the beginning, Bill had strong views about software. He believed it should be paid for, that programmers deserved compensation for their work. This seems obvious now, but in the 1970s hobbyist culture, software was often freely shared. People bought hardware. Software was something you wrote yourself or copied from others. Bill wrote an open letter to hobbyists in 1976, essentially accusing them of stealing by copying software without paying. Who can afford to do professional work for nothing? He asked. The letter was controversial and made Bill unpopular in hobbyist circles, but it articulated a principle he would fight for throughout his career. Software was valuable intellectual property. Microsoft's early years were chaotic. The company developed versions of BASIC for various microcomputers, created other programming tools, and slowly built a business. They moved from Albuquerque back to Seattle in 1979. They were making money, but they were still a small company in an emerging industry. Then, in 1980, IBM came calling. IBM was developing a personal computer and needed an operating system. They approached Microsoft, which didn't have an operating system but did have something more valuable: credibility and connections. What happened next is one of the most consequential deals in business history. Microsoft didn't create an operating system from scratch. Instead, Bill bought an existing operating system called QDOS, Quick and Dirty Operating System, from a Seattle programmer for $50,000. Microsoft modified it, renamed it MS-DOS, and licensed it to IBM. The crucial detail: Microsoft retained the right to license MS-DOS to other companies. IBM apparently didn't realize how important this would be. They thought the money was in hardware. Software was just something to make the hardware useful. Bill understood differently. He knew that if personal computers became a mass market, and if many companies made compatible machines, software that worked across all of them would become incredibly valuable. He had positioned Microsoft to own that software. As the PC market exploded through the 1980s, dozens of companies created IBM-compatible computers. Every one of them needed an operating system. Most licensed MS-DOS from Microsoft. Bill Gates, still in his 20s, was becoming very wealthy as Microsoft collected licensing fees from the entire industry. But Bill wasn't satisfied with DOS. He could see the future in graphical user interfaces, computers controlled with a mouse, with windows and icons instead of typed commands. Apple had demonstrated this with the Macintosh. Xerox had invented it even earlier. Bill was determined that Microsoft would dominate this future too. Microsoft Windows, first released in 1985, was initially crude and limited. But Bill had patience and resources. Version after version, Windows improved. Microsoft used its DOS dominance to push Windows, bundling them together, using its relationships with computer manufacturers to ensure Windows came pre-installed on new machines. Apple sued, claiming Microsoft had copied the Macintosh interface. The lawsuit was complex, involving questions about what could be copyrighted in a user interface and what Microsoft had been allowed to see under previous agreements. Microsoft ultimately prevailed, and Windows continued growing. By 1990, Microsoft was dominant in both operating systems and business software. Windows was becoming the standard. Microsoft Office Word, Excel, and PowerPoint bundled together was crushing competitors in business productivity software. The company's revenues were growing exponentially. But success brought scrutiny. Competitors complained that Microsoft was using unfair tactics, bundling products to kill competition, using its operating system dominance to favor Microsoft applications, making it difficult for rivals to compete. The Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission began investigating. Bill's response was characteristically aggressive. He defended Microsoft's practices, argued that the company succeeded through innovation and efficiency, and resisted any suggestion that Microsoft had done anything wrong. But the investigations continued, eventually leading to the famous antitrust trial of the late 1990s. The trial revealed a side of Bill Gates that the public hadn't fully seen. In videotaped depositions, he was evasive, argumentative, and combative. He claimed not to remember emails he'd written, quibbled over the meanings of common words, and generally appeared to be playing games rather than answering honestly. The performance was damaging. Here was one of the world's richest and most powerful business leaders acting like a difficult teenager caught misbehaving. The judge found Microsoft had violated antitrust laws and initially ordered the company be broken up into separate entities. That breakup never happened. Microsoft appealed and reached a settlement that imposed restrictions but kept the company intact. But the trial damaged both Microsoft's reputation and Bill's personal image. He was no longer just the brilliant entrepreneur. He was also the monopolist who had crushed competitors through market power rather than pure merit. This was perhaps unfair in some ways. Microsoft had created genuinely good products that people chose to use. Windows and Office succeeded partly because they worked well and were familiar to users. But it was also true that Microsoft had used aggressive tactics, had leveraged its operating system dominance to favor its other products, and had made it very difficult for competitors to succeed. During these years, Bill's personal life was also evolving. He had married Melinda French in 1994. Melinda had worked at Microsoft, was intelligent and driven, and shared Bill's interest in using wealth for social good. Their relationship would prove crucial not just personally but in shaping Bill's later life direction. Bill and Melinda began seriously thinking about philanthropy in the late 1990s. They created the William H. Gates Foundation, initially focused on global health issues. The foundation's approach reflected Bill's personality, data-driven, focused on measurable outcomes, willing to tackle problems others considered too difficult. In 2000, they consolidated their philanthropic efforts into the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, committing billions of dollars to global health, education, and poverty reduction. The foundation's resources and approach would eventually make it one of the most powerful forces in global health. But philanthropy was initially a side project. Bill was still running Microsoft, still focused on software and technology. That began changing in the early 2000s as he started stepping back from day-to-day operations. In 2000, Bill handed the CEO role to Steve Ballmer, his longtime friend and Microsoft's longtime president. Bill remained chairman and chief software architect, still deeply involved in product strategy and development. But he was beginning to transition. The 2000s brought new challenges for Microsoft. The company missed major technology shifts: search, mobile, social media. Google, not Microsoft, dominated internet search. Apple's iPhone, not Windows Mobile, defined smartphones. Facebook, not any Microsoft product, became the social platform. These failures weren't entirely Bill's fault. Some happened after he'd stepped back from daily management. But they revealed limitations in Microsoft's culture and approach. The company had become defensive, focused on protecting existing businesses rather than imagining new futures. The aggressive competitiveness that had built Microsoft's dominance became a liability when rapid innovation was required. In 2008, Bill Gates fully stepped away from day-to-day involvement with Microsoft to focus on the Gates Foundation. It was a remarkable transition from technology CEO to full-time philanthropist, from building software to fighting malaria, from competing in business to collaborating on global health challenges. The Gates Foundation's work is worth examining in detail because it represents Bill's approach applied to entirely different problems than software. The foundation identified high-impact areas where relatively modest investments could save millions of lives: vaccines, malaria prevention, improved sanitation, agricultural development. Bill brought the same intensity to philanthropy that he'd brought to Microsoft. He read scientific papers obsessively, questioned experts aggressively, and demanded evidence for claims. He wanted to know exactly how each dollar would be spent and what measurable outcomes it would produce. This approach had strengths and weaknesses. On the positive side, the Gates Foundation achieved remarkable successes. Vaccination rates increased dramatically in poor countries. Malaria deaths decreased significantly. New agricultural techniques improved food security. The foundation's resources and focus made measurable differences in millions of lives. On the negative side, critics argued the foundation's approach was too top-down, that it favored technical solutions over addressing underlying social and political problems, and that it gave one wealthy couple disproportionate influence over global health priorities. When the Gates Foundation decided to fund something that influenced what organizations worldwide worked on, potentially distorting priorities. Bill's response to these criticisms echoed his Microsoft-era defenses. The foundation followed the evidence, worked with experts, and achieved results. If other approaches worked better, they'd adopt them. But measurable impact on mortality and disease was the ultimate test. In 2010, Bill and Melinda, along with Warren Buffett, created the Giving Pledge, encouraging billionaires to commit to giving away at least half their wealth during their lifetimes or in their wills. Dozens of wealthy individuals and families signed on, representing hundreds of billions in eventual charitable contributions. The Giving Pledge reflected Bill's evolution from competitive businessman to collaborative philanthropist. He was using his influence not to defeat competitors but to encourage peers to join in addressing global challenges. It was a fundamentally different way of thinking about impact and success. Through the 2010s, Bill became increasingly focused on climate change, pandemic preparedness, and education reform. He wrote extensively about technological approaches to reducing carbon emissions and gave talks about the need for better preparation for global health crises. He funded research into nuclear reactor designs, agricultural innovation, and disease surveillance systems. His work on pandemic preparedness reflected years of study and concern about global health vulnerabilities. The Gates Foundation invested heavily in vaccine development and distribution systems, building infrastructure that could respond to future disease outbreaks. But this high-profile work also raised genuine questions about concentrated power and wealth. Should one person, however well-intentioned, have so much influence over global health priorities? Even if the Gates Foundation did good work, was it appropriate that unelected billionaires shaped policies affecting billions of people? These aren't easy questions, and Bill's own answers evolved over time. He acknowledged that concentrated wealth was problematic, hence the commitment to giving it away. He argued that expertise and evidence should guide decisions, and the foundation followed both. But he also recognized that no amount of good intentions fully resolved the tension between philanthropy and democracy. Bill's personal life remained relatively private during these years, though his partnership with Melinda in running the foundation continued to be central to both their work and their lives together. The foundation they built represented not just Bill's vision but a genuine collaboration between two people committed to using their resources for global good. Still, questions emerged over time about workplace culture and personal judgment. Reports of behavior that made colleagues uncomfortable and associations that raised eyebrows reminded observers that extraordinary achievement in one area, business success or philanthropic impact, doesn't make someone a good person generally. Bill Gates changed computing, created enormous wealth, and funded work that saved millions of lives. He also created a ruthless corporate culture and exercised power in ways that warrant scrutiny. As we consider Bill Gates' legacy from the perspective of 2026, several things stand out. First, his impact on personal computing is undeniable. Microsoft's software, for better and worse, shaped how billions of people used computers for decades. Windows and Office became infrastructure, so ubiquitous that most people stopped thinking about them. Second, his transition from businessman to philanthropist is remarkable, if complicated. Few people have committed comparable resources to global health and development. Whether the foundation's approach is ideal is debatable, but the commitment and impact are real. Third, his story reveals tensions in how we think about wealth, power, and responsibility. Bill earned his fortune through innovation and aggressive business tactics. He's giving it away through philanthropy guided by his own priorities and beliefs. Both the earning and the giving raise questions about who should have such resources and influence. The Microsoft years established patterns we see throughout Bill's life: intense focus, competitive drive, belief in the power of smart people solving problems, impatience with what he perceived as inefficiency or irrationality, and willingness to push boundaries. These traits built an empire in software. They achieved remarkable things in global health. They also created corporate and personal situations that were problematic. The same intensity that drove success also drove excess. Bill's relationship with Steve Jobs is worth considering because it illuminated their different approaches. Steve focused on integration and beauty, controlling entire products to ensure quality. Bill focused on ubiquity and compatibility, creating software that ran everywhere. Steve wanted to create perfect things few could afford. Bill wanted to create adequate things everyone could use. Neither approach was purely right or wrong. Steve's products were often better designed and more satisfying to use. Bill's products reached far more people and became genuine infrastructure. The Mac versus Windows debates of the 1980s and 90s reflected genuinely different philosophies about technology, business, and what mattered most. Their personal relationship was complex, competitive but respectful, combative but occasionally collaborative. When Steve was sick, Bill visited him, and they talked for hours about their lives and work. They were rivals who needed each other, who pushed each other, and who ultimately respected what the other had achieved even while disagreeing about approach. Bill's intellectual evolution is also notable. He started as a pure technologist, focused on software and computing. He became a businessman obsessed with market share and competition. He evolved into a philanthropist focused on health and development. He's now engaging with climate change, nuclear energy, and existential risks to humanity. This trajectory reflects both personal growth and the advantages of wealth. Bill could pursue whatever interested him, could fund research into speculative technologies, could take long-term views unconstrained by quarterly earnings pressure. The same money that critics argued gave him excessive influence also enabled him to think differently than people constrained by normal economic pressures. His reading habits are legendary. He reads dozens of books yearly, often deeply technical works on subjects he's exploring. His annual summer reading lists influence what millions of people read. His ability to absorb complex information quickly and identify key insights is remarkable. But this intellectual firepower also created blind spots. Bill could be dismissive of perspectives that didn't fit his analytical framework, could overlook social and political factors while focusing on technical solutions, and could underestimate the importance of things that weren't easily measurable. The education reform efforts funded by the Gates Foundation illustrate this. The foundation invested billions in improving education, funding initiatives like small schools, charter schools, and teacher evaluation systems based on test scores. Many of these initiatives had disappointing results. Bill eventually acknowledged that improving education was more complex than they'd anticipated, that their assumptions were sometimes wrong, and that they needed to listen more to teachers and students. It was a rare admission of failure, and it led to adjusted strategies. This willingness to acknowledge mistakes and adjust course distinguishes Bill from many powerful people. He genuinely seemed to care about outcomes more than ego, to value evidence over being right, and to change approaches when evidence indicated current strategies weren't working. The climate work is interesting because it shows Bill applying lessons from previous efforts. He's focused on innovation in energy technology, nuclear, battery storage, carbon capture, while acknowledging that technology alone isn't sufficient, that policy and behavior change matter too. He's more humble about complexity while remaining ambitious about impact. As Bill enters his 70s, his influence remains substantial. The Gates Foundation continues operating at massive scale. His opinions on technology, health, and climate are widely covered and influential. His wealth, even after giving away tens of billions, remains enormous. But the world's relationship with billionaire philanthropists has changed. There's more skepticism about whether massive private foundations are appropriate, more questioning of the power wealthy individuals wield over public priorities, more concern about whether philanthropy addresses root causes or just symptoms. Bill has engaged with these critiques more seriously in recent years, acknowledging concerns about inequality and concentrated wealth. He supports higher taxes on the wealthy, including himself. He argues for systemic changes alongside philanthropy. But he also continues believing that smart people with resources can identify high-impact interventions and fund them effectively. The question of Bill Gates' ultimate legacy is complicated because his career spans such different phases. The Microsoft years built wealth and transformed computing, but also involved aggressive business practices and antitrust violations. The philanthropy years saved millions of lives but also concentrated power in ways that raised democratic concerns. The personal story includes both remarkable achievements and troubling behaviors. Perhaps the most interesting aspect is how Bill's story reflects broader questions about technology, capitalism, and power in contemporary society. He embodied both the promise of technology entrepreneurship innovation creating value and wealth and its problems monopoly power, aggressive tactics, and concentrated influence. His philanthropy embodies both the best case for billionaire giving using resources for high-impact interventions that save lives and concerns about it unelected individuals shaping global priorities based on personal beliefs rather than democratic processes. From the Lakeside Teletype to the Gates Foundation headquarters, from MS-DOS to malaria eradication, from Harvard dropout to presidential advisor, Bill Gates' journey encompasses multiple transformations. The obsessive teenager who coded for days without sleeping became the businessman who built a monopoly, who became the philanthropist fighting global disease, who became the climate advocate warning about existential risks. Whether each transformation represented genuine growth or just the same intensity applied to new problems is debatable. The analytical approach, the focus on measurable outcomes, the impatience with inefficiency, the belief that smart people could solve any problem, these remained constant even as the problems changed. The boy who hated to lose at family games became the man who couldn't tolerate losing in business, who approached philanthropy with the same competitive intensity, who measured success in lives saved rather than market share captured. The fundamental drive remained, only the arena changed. In the end, Bill Gates' story is about the power and limits of intelligence, focus, and resources. He achieved extraordinary things through all three. He also demonstrated that these qualities alone don't make someone wise, don't guarantee good judgment in all areas, and don't resolve fundamental questions about power, fairness, and how society should be organized. The software that billions used, the lives that millions kept because of vaccines and malaria prevention, the climate research that might help avoid catastrophe, the questions about monopoly power and concentrated wealth that his career raised, all of it represents Bill Gates' complex, contradictory, and undeniably significant impact on the world. From a Seattle childhood to global influence, from computer obsession to public health champion, from ruthless competitor to collaborative philanthropist, Bill Gates' life defies simple categorization. He changed the world repeatedly, for better and worse, And his story continues evolving in ways that reveal as much about our society's relationship with technology, wealth, and power as about the man himself.